In Module 7, we are primarily considering worldview and the significance of worldview for our interaction with others and our ability to empathize with them. And then also we're looking at free will, determinism, and compatibilism. And this PowerPoint is going to be addressing the theory of multiple intelligences because it's one of those things that does cause us to have there be differences between ourselves and others. It's that we see the world through different eyes. So the first thing I want to say to you is that you're smarter than you think you are. Even if you're arrogant, you're smarter than you think you are because you're smarter in different ways than most of you are aware. I want to introduce to you Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, which I find that pretty much all of my students have never heard about before. Howard Gardner is a professor from Harvard whose research was opposed pretty strongly at first, but across the years even those who are educators who were kind of really strictly sticking to the idea of standardized testing and the way that SATs and those sorts of things are set up realized that there was validity to what he was saying. So what his point is it's not how smart you are, it's how you are smart. This is a wheel just showing the different types of intelligence that he speaks about. You can see bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, verbal linguistic, logical mathematical, naturalistic, intrapersonal, visual spatial, and musical. And he has some other forms of intelligence as well. But these are the basic wheel. And so they're known as body smart, people smart, and so on, as you can see. Here's just another layout showing those same sorts of things. So this is the SAT model of intelligence. It measures your language/reading and writing abilities, and it also measures your mathematical abilities. And a lot of people conclude that they're stupid if they haven't scored very high on their SAT scores. And the reality is, according to Gardner, that you're more like this. You're more like a Swiss Army knife. You have multiple forms of intelligence, amongst which are those that we usually measure using standardized testing. This is a letter to me in response to inquiries I'd made with Dr. Gardner. I've communicated with him across time. I just want you to see that this is something that has mattered to me. It was important to me in the upbringing of our children that we would understand their different types of intelligence. It was through Howard Gardner I became aware of their different types of intelligence. And it's important to me as far as being a professor as well, that my students would be aware of their different types of intelligence. Human beings have very different types of intellectual strengths, and these strengths are very important to how you learn and how you represent things in your mind. Your mind constellates imagery. This is something that goes back to before you were able to communicate verbally, that your mind had images that it constellated in order to communicate things. And your intelligences have an impact even on that, things at a very basic level cognitively. The idea of the theory of multiple intelligences is that humans demonstrate a depth and a complexity like no other species. We have numerous systems at work in one brain. And even if you don't develop them all, your brain is latently wired. It has the latent neural pathways to develop all these different sorts of intelligence. This is a free online test which will help you to identify your own personal mix of intelligences. That's just to give you the address. You can just hit pause on the video if you want to be able to get that and look it up. So the traditional views of intelligence and IQ come to us primarily through the work of Alfred Binet and Louis Terman. Alfred Binet had a partner with whom he worked, and this is at the turn of the last century. And what they were actually trying to do was identify people who had very limited intelligence in terms of actually eugenics and eugenic purposes, as far as those people not reproducing was what was back of those who were asking him to do this. But Binet realized that people did have measurable intelligence in the areas especially of their verbal, linguistic, and communicatory capabilities, and also in their mathematical abilities. Louis Terman picked this up and ran with it, and ultimately from this came our IQ tests. Now, IQ and intelligence are not actually the same thing, although we call it the intelligence quotient is what IQ stands for. IQ is really just a statistic, the ratio of your mental age to your chronological age. And there's actually two forms of IQ. I'm not going to get into all that. I'm here to speak to you about multiple intelligences. It was created as an indicator of who would do well in school and thus in life. So Binet took it in a positive direction when there was a negative intent behind it at the turn of the last century. There's obviously more to human intelligence than just a set of tests. There really is. The IQ test, and really most all standardized tests, are only able to measure scholastic intelligence, or intelligence that has to do with the things that we primarily focus on in schools, especially in the schools that bring us up to the point where you now are as an undergrad. The tendency in the developed West is to see this as a function of genetics and how one is born. Intelligence is like height or skin color. It's inherited. The tendency in the developed East is to see this as a function of effort and diligence in study. That's a cultural difference. And in the East, there is this really strong emphasis upon that those who really work and who try hard and who burn the midnight oil, they're the ones who are going to thrive and do well in real life. Were we to take the IQ approach literally, then we would expect that those who are good at one thing are good at everything, and those who are mediocre at one thing are mediocre at everything. But that really doesn't square with what we find in life, does it? Nobody believes it simply because life experience doesn't allow them to believe it. They've encountered people who have not done well in terms of regular schooling, but in whom they can see brilliance. I remember listening to an educator in upstate New York years ago who was angry that this man who'd never graduated from college was making six-figure income in the world of construction, and it didn't seem fair to him because he'd done college and he ought to be the one making a six-figure income. He didn't get it, that there were other forms of intelligence that might be well rewarded. Plumbers, in the United States anyway, don't typically go through a process of acquiring debt and doing the sort of things that you're doing here at Husson, but they make really, really good money. We all know the student who's either has academic issues or behavioral issues or both, who turns out he or she is brilliant at music or art or science or athletics. And I would submit to you, on the basis of what Gardner has observed, this is a function of that individual's intelligences. Also, we know brilliant students in math and language and reading who are socially awkward and physically uncoordinated, thus the terms nerd and geek. So this theory is empirical, but not experimental, Gardner's theory. It's that it's observed, but it's not that there's a whole lot of research done to prove that it actually exists. What it's usually a matter of is getting people who've worked with others educationally across their lifetime to recognize and say, oh yeah, I can see that. That it's just obvious, it's empirical, it's out there in the evidence. You can't do an experiment to show that it is true or false, right or wrong. There are a lot of things which we believe which function this way. This is a theory based on a large amount of observation of human beings across time. It's based on evidence, but not on statistics and not on inductive reasoning, whereby papers are put forward in journals and then that there's refutation and peer review and all those sorts of things. It's a little bit different as far as how it goes forward. If we contrast human beings with other species, what we always find is an incredibly rich potentiality and a multi-layered way of seeing, perceiving, and responding to their world. For other species, there are determinate characteristics which they all share. Many of them are very intelligent creatures, no question. But for humans, we're a little bit different. There are potentialities which we share, but we can then take those potentialities in many directions. Thus, two identical human twins can develop in very, very different ways. So I don't want to say there's an infinite plasticity to human beings, but I do want to say that we have the potential to go in many different directions, and that's a little bit different from the rest of the animal kingdom. The idea of the theory of multiple intelligences is that humans demonstrate a depth and a complexity like no other species. There are an awful lot of cognitive researchers who would stand behind that statement. We have numerous systems at work in our one brain. Some of us have more systems at work than others of us do. That's true, that's just simple. Very few of us seem to have the exact same mix of intelligences. We seem to be that there's this broad panoply of different compositions of human personality and intelligence. So the first of these, and it's one of the ones we do measure with our standardized testing, is linguistic intelligence. So verbal linguistic, or what Gardner calls word smart learning, is learning through the spoken and written word. This intelligence was always valued at the traditional classroom and in traditional assessments of intelligence and achievement. Logical/mathematical intelligence is called math smart in his system, learning through reasoning and problem solving and also logic. I don't know if you're aware, but over the door of Plato's Academy was a sign that said, "None but geometers may enter here." So logic and mathematics have a lot in common. Also, it's highly valued in the traditional classroom, mathematical ability and intelligence is, right, where students were asked to adapt to logically sequenced delivery of instruction. These two intelligences are what we test for in IQ tests, in SAT tests, and other standardized tests. So this is one of my former students whose permission I have to use her name and her picture. I had her back in 2013, and you can see that she's an Asian American, and Asians, period, as far as culturally, the subcultures, tend to have a strong emphasis in their subcultures that there would be great diligence and that they would have outstanding scores on tests. She's a nursing major. She's a nurse now. She was a nursing major. And she didn't feel like she was as bright as the other kids that she went to school with who were her fellow Asian Americans. But what Kristen did have, I think she was quite bright, but she didn't have that same opinion. What Kristen did have was an extraordinary mix of intelligences, especially when it came to people, which obviously will serve her well in the nursing world. She had intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence, meaning she's intelligent about herself and setting limits for herself and her own abilities and capabilities. She's also intelligent about other people and could pick up a lot of nonverbals. And it was really obvious. She's so socially adept. And so when she heard about this theory, this was, she said, "Oh," and she was really encouraged by it. And so she has given me permission to use her name and to speak to you about her because it helped her to realize I am smart. There's then musical intelligence, musical rhythmic or music smart, learning through patterns, rhythms, and music. This includes not only auditory, the ears, but the identification of patterns through all of the senses, especially think of rhythm above all others. Then there's spatial intelligence. So visual spatial or picture smart is learning visually and organizing ideas spatially. They say of Einstein that he saw the mathematical concepts that he was dealing with as pictures in his mind, and that the part of the brain which forms mental images was enlarged in Einstein's brain. Seeing concepts in action in order to understand them, the ability to see things in one's mind, in planning to create a product or solve a problem, to be able to make a flow chart, or there's a whole lot of things here, but it's picture smart. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence, or body smart, learning through interaction with one's environment. This intelligence tends to promote understanding through concrete experience, and people who have bodily kinesthetic intelligence, quite frankly, tend to have a physical grace to them. Intrapersonal intelligence is this. It's called self-smart, learning through feelings and values and attitudes. This is one of the intelligences that I especially know Kristen had. This is a decidedly affective or feelings-based component of learning through which students they place value on what they learn and take ownership for their learning. Then there's interpersonal intelligence, or people smart, learning through interaction with others. This is not the domain of children who are simply talkative or overly social. That's not the idea. We're not talking about the person who's a real outgoing extrovert. This intelligence promotes collaboration and working cooperatively with others. It's an actual intelligence with regard to people. I have to say my wife has this, and I've had that educators whom I know who've watched her interact with children say you can't teach the things she already knows about how to motivate and connect with children. Then there's the naturalist intelligence, or nature smart, or also called science smart, learning through classifications, categories, and hierarchies. These people tend to be naturally prone towards doing taxonomy, trying to sort into different species and that sort of thing. The naturalist intelligence picks up on subtle differences in meaning. It's not simply the study of nature. It can be used really in all areas of study. Then there's existential intelligence, or spiritual metaphysical smart, learning by seeing the big picture. The person who naturally does metaphysics, they're looking at, why are we here? What is my role in the world? What is my place in family and school and community? This intelligence seeks connections to real-world understandings and application of new learning. So perhaps some would not call this spiritual, but that's, spirituality is typically looking at the connectedness of life and how things all fit into one holistic picture. So here's two claims which Howard Gardner makes. One, we all have these intelligences to some degree. They're part of what it means to be a human being. And then two, no two people, not even identical twins, have the same profile of intelligences. And life experience, I'm in my early 60s, causes me to say, yeah, that's right. I'm going to leave you with this story. You can look it up online. You look for May Lemke's Boy on YouTube. May Lemke was a nurse who lived in Wisconsin. She adopted a little boy of 6 months whom nobody wanted. He had glaucoma, cerebral palsy, and brain damage. The doctors had had to remove his eyes. To feed him, May had to push food down his throat. It was a year before Leslie could chew food on his own. He had been neglected. It took 7 years of constant care before Leslie showed any progress. During this time, he made no sounds or movements and showed no emotions. He was like a catatonic child. He was 12 before he first learned to stand, and he was 15 before he learned to walk. When he was 16, May found Leslie playing Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto No. 1 during the middle of the night. She had no idea where the sound was coming from. Of course, he had no eyes, so dark and light, night and day, were alike to him. He'd recently heard the piece on television. Leslie was soon playing all styles of music, from ragtime to classical, and there's a place where you can go and look and see his story. But it's incredible. He ultimately wound up as an adult who does concerts, still to the present day, last I checked, with his sister, who's May's actual biological daughter, who takes her brother, her adoptive brother, around on these concerts, and he performs as a concert performer, and he speaks to the audience, this little boy who used to be like he was catatonic, which says that we all have this rich potential as far as the intelligence which is within us. And also in terms of worldview, what it means is you just don't know what someone's capabilities might be, and the mix that they have makes them be a little bit different from you. That's been a theme with my students this semester, talking about how different people are in their perceptions. And this is one of the reasons why, because they have this fascinating mixture of intelligences. I want to close with this concept. It comes from Aristotle. Aristotle has the concept, you see the little acorn in the foreground, that you and every other human being has packed into themselves the way that acorn has packed into it that beautiful oak in the background. We have the potentiality to develop and grow and to have there be a flourishing and a maturation of our intelligences in such a way that something beautiful is packed within us. And it's a wonderful way to look at the people around you to see how rich their potentialities are. It's a great worldview help. And I'll end there.